They did not come to negotiate. They did not come to observe. They came with the silence of dead stars and the patience of something that had been consuming galaxies long before humanity learned to walk upright. And when their fleet crossed the boundary of the local group, every telescope on Earth went dark at the same moment, as though the universe itself had decided to stop watching. There is a question that has haunted physicists since the first human mind was bold enough to ask it. What is the most destructive force in existence? Not a bomb, not a star, not even a supernova. The answer is a black hole, a wound in space-time so absolute that not even light escapes its verdict. Nothing enters and returns. The event horizon is not a wall, it is an ending. And humanity, standing at the edge of its own extinction, looked into that abyss and did not flinch. Instead, they picked it up. And they built a gun. Welcome to Beyond Impossible, where humanity refuses to be a footnote in someone else's conquest. This is the story of the most audacious, most terrifying, and most consequential weapon ever conceived by a mortal mind. The invasion forced humanity's hand. What humanity built in response will echo through the structure of the cosmos for longer than civilizations have existed to measure time. This is where it begins. The first contact was not a transmission. It was a deletion. On the night of March 7, 2187, the Andromeda Early Warning Array, humanity's most sophisticated deep space sensor network, stretching across 11 relay stations and 4 decades of engineering, simply stopped reporting. Not a malfunction, not a Cascade failure. The stations were gone, consumed in a span of 6 seconds, as though something vast and unhurried had reached across cosmological distance and erased them the way a hand wipes dust from a surface. By the time the silence reached Earth, the fleet had already crossed into the Milky Way's outer spiral arms. Commander Yale Oren was aboard the UES Meridian, humanity's Joint Command flagship, when the tactical display updated for the first time in 47 minutes. What it showed made her go very still. Across 3,000 light-years of the galaxy's trailing edge, 17 inhabited colony systems had gone dark. The gravitational signature data recovered from surviving deep-field buoys told a story that Chief Astrophysicist Dr. Emeka Solis could barely bring himself to read aloud. The invaders were not using conventional weapons. They were using geometry. Their ships, structures so massive they registered as gravitational anomalies on instruments calibrated for neutron stars, were rearranging the orbital mechanics of entire systems, shearing planetary magnetospheres with focused relativistic frame drag until atmospheres peeled away into the void like skin from bone. 17 worlds, 4.3 billion people, gone in a time frame too short to evacuate a single city block. Solis pulled up the trajectory modeling on the central holographic table, and the room fell into the kind of silence that only descends when people have understood something irreversible. The fleet was not scattering. It was not raiding. It was advancing in a single unified vector directly toward the core systems, toward Earth, toward every concentration of human life with the methodical confidence of something that had done this before and expected no resistance worth noting. At its current rate, the outer colonies of the Sol corridor had 10 weeks. Earth had 4 months. Every conventional platform humanity had ever built, kinetic impactors, antimatter warheads, directed energy arrays capable of melting continents, had already been deployed against the fleet's advance elements. The gravitational shielding surrounding each vessel absorbed everything without measurable effect, the way an ocean absorbs a stone dropped from a child's hand. Admiral Priya Voss spoke first. "We cannot hurt them," she said quietly. "Not with anything we have." She let that sit for 3 seconds, then opened a file that had existed for 30 years in the deepest classification tier of the Unified Science Council. a theoretical weapons framework so extreme it had never been moved past the proposal stage. She placed it on the table. Every person in that room read the title. No one spoke for a very long time. The file was called Project Singularity, and it described in precise and terrifying mathematical detail a device capable of compressing exotic matter into a stable microsingularity and firing it across galactic distances at a relativistic fraction of the speed of light. A gun that fired black holes. It had never been built because, until today, humanity had hoped it would never need to be. The authorization came within 6 hours. No committee deliberation, no public debate. Admiral Voss transmitted a single encrypted command to the Unified Science Council, and Project Singularity moved from theoretical archive to active weapons program before the sun rose over Geneva. Every resource humanity possessed, manufacturing capacity, energy infrastructure, the combined intellectual firepower of 4,000 of the finest scientific minds alive, was redirected toward a single objective. They had 4 months. It was, by any reasonable measure, not enough time. They decided it would have to be. Dr. Emeka Solis was appointed Chief Weapons Architect, a title that had never existed before and that he accepted with the quiet gravity of a man who understood exactly what it meant. His core team assembled within 48 hours aboard the Meridian, now repositioned to the far side of Jupiter, where the gas giant's immense magnetospheric shielding offered at least a theoretical buffer against detection. The engineering challenge they faced was not merely difficult. It was, by the established laws of physics, supposed to be impossible. To create a stable microsingularity, they needed to compress a mass equivalent to a small moon into a volume smaller than a proton, hold it in a state of controlled quantum decoherence long enough to aim it, and then release it with enough directional precision to hit a target moving at relativistic speeds across tens of thousands of light years. Every single step of that process violated at least one principle that had been considered inviolable since Einstein. Solis didn't start with the gun. He started with the ammunition. The theoretical framework in Project Singularity called for the use of stabilized exotic matter with negative energy density, to prevent the microsingularity from evaporating via Hawking radiation before it could be deployed. The problem was that exotic matter had never been produced in quantities larger than a few subatomic particles, and they needed kilograms of it. Commander Oren watched him work through 3 consecutive sleepless cycles, filling display after display with equations that seemed to bend the room's geometry just by existing on the screen. On the morning of the 4th day, Solis looked up and said with absolute calm that he thought he had found a pathway. Not a certainty, a pathway. It involved harvesting quantum vacuum fluctuations from the boundary layer of an existing gravitational field, specifically from the accretion disk of a small black hole, which meant they needed a black hole to build the weapon that fired black holes. Oren stared at him for a long moment. "Where?" she asked carefully. "Do we get the first one?" Solis pulled up a star chart and pointed to a stellar remnant 11 light-years from their position, a collapsed dwarf with a confirmed event horizon, small enough to approach, large enough to harvest. "We go get it," he said simply. The mission to reach the stellar remnant launched within 72 hours. 3 vessels, skeleton crews, equipment that had been redesigned from scratch in under a week. As they crossed the 11 light-years at maximum relativistic drive, the invasion fleet continued its advance, consuming 2 more colony systems with the same unhurried inevitability. The clock was no longer abstract. It was written in the names of the dead. The stellar remnant designated as Ara-7 was not a place built for human survival. At 11 light-years from Jupiter, it was a collapsed dwarf of approximately 3 solar masses, its event horizon a sphere of absolute negation barely 40 kilometers in diameter, surrounded by an accretion disk of superheated plasma spinning at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The radiation environment alone was enough to degrade unshielded hull plating in under 6 minutes. The three vessels approached in tight formation, their magnetospheric shielding pushed to maximum capacity, their crews working in rotations of 20 minutes on, 40 minutes off, because prolonged exposure to the gravitational gradient at that proximity caused disorientation severe enough to render a person unable to read instrument displays. This was where humanity had come to harvest the building blocks of its salvation. It felt, to everyone aboard, considerably more like the edge of a grave. Solis directed the operation from the lead vessel, the research corvette Ashford, running extraction calculations in real time as the harvesting array deployed into the accretion disk's outer boundary layer. The process was delicate in a way that the word delicate utterly failed to capture. The quantum vacuum fluctuations they needed existed in a razor-thin band between the disk's outer thermal gradient and the point where relativistic frame drag became too intense for their equipment to function. Too close, and the array would be torn apart by tidal forces and spaghettified into a stream of individual atoms. Too far, and the fluctuation density dropped below the threshold needed for exotic matter synthesis. Solis had calculated the precise distance to within 11 meters. He had also calculated that SR-7's gravitational field was not perfectly uniform. It pulsed, subtly, in a 17-minute cycle, and each pulse shifted that razor-thin band by up to 40 meters in either direction. They were threading a needle that moved. For the first 9 hours, the extraction proceeded within acceptable parameters. Then the Ashford's second harvesting array failed, not from equipment malfunction, but because the gravitational pulse cycle had shifted, arriving 4 minutes earlier than predicted, and the array had been caught in a frame drag spike that sheared 3 of its 6 collection nodes clean off the mounting strut. Solis absorbed this without visible reaction and immediately began recalculating the approach angle for the remaining array. Lieutenant Commander Dara Finch, the Ashford's pilot, executed the repositioning with a precision that left no margin for error and no room for a second attempt. She brought the vessel to within 9 meters of Solis's revised coordinate and held it there by hand for 6 hours straight, while the gravitational gradient tried continuously to pull them into an orbit that would have ended in the event horizon. They got what they needed, barely. The exotic matter yield was 63% of the minimum threshold Solis had specified, enough to build 1 functional round. Not 2, not a test firing followed by a combat deployment. 1 shot, everything humanity had, everything it was risking, every life already lost to the invasion fleet's advance, came down to a single compressed singularity and the question of whether they could aim it true. As the 3 vessels broke from SR-7's gravity well and turned back toward Jupiter, Solis stared at the yield data for a long time before he finally spoke. "We don't get to miss," he said. No one in the room disagreed. They had 6 weeks left when the Ashford returned to Jupiter. The invasion fleet had consumed 4 more colony systems in their absence, and the gravitational wake of its advance was now detectable from Earth's own sensor arrays. A slow, creeping distortion in the background metric of local spacetime, like the pressure drop before a storm of incomprehensible scale. The Unified Science Council had used the time well. In the shadow of Jupiter's magnetosphere, a construction platform the size of a small continent had been assembled from every available manufacturing asset in the solar system. Project Singularity's physical architecture was already 40% complete. What waited for Solis when he docked was not a weapons lab. It was a cathedral of human desperation, built from titanium and quantum field emitters, and the collective refusal of 8 billion people to accept that this was how their story ended. The weapon itself was unlike anything ever constructed. Designated the Singularity Projection System, SB-1, though the crews building it had taken to calling it simply the Godgun. It was 3 kilometers long, its barrel a series of nested magnetic containment rings capable of generating a field strong enough to hold a compressed singularity in stable suspension for up to 90 seconds before quantum decoherence destabilized the exotic matter lattice, and the round simply ceased to exist. The firing mechanism drew power from a zero-point energy tap that consumed the equivalent output of Jupiter's entire atmospheric pressure gradient. An energy source so vast that activating it would permanently alter the gas giant's storm systems. They were going to scar Jupiter to fire one bullet. The scale of what they were doing settled over the construction platform like a physical weight. Solis worked without sleep for 11 days straight, and Commander Oren stopped trying to order him to rest after the 3rd day, because the equations he was producing in his 38th consecutive hour of wakefulness were more precise than anything his team could generate fresh. The targeting problem was the final and most savage obstacle. The invasion fleet's lead vessels were positioned 43,000 light-years from Jupiter, deep in the galaxy's outer Perseus arm, and they were moving. A projectile traveling at 0.94 the speed of light. The maximum velocity the SB-1's containment system could impart without destabilizing the singularity would take 46 years to reach a stationary target at that distance. The fleet was not stationary. Solis needed to calculate not where the fleet was, but where it would be in 46 years, accounting for relativistic drift, gravitational interactions with 17 major stellar bodies along the projected flight path, and the possibility that the fleet would alter its course upon detecting the launch. It was the most complex targeting solution in the history of warfare. He solved it in 9 days. When he handed the coordinates to Admiral Voss, his hands were steady. The weapon was complete on a Tuesday morning, 14 days ahead of the deadline Voss had privately considered impossible. The exotic matter round was loaded into the containment chamber with a care that bordered on reverence, 63% yield, 1 shot. The weight of humanity's survival compressed into a volume smaller than a human fist. Voss looked at Solis across the command deck and asked him one final time if he was certain. He looked back at her with eyes that had not seen proper sleep in nearly 2 weeks, and said with complete and terrible conviction that he was certain of the math. What came after the math, he said quietly, was something none of them could calculate. Voss nodded. She gave the order. The zero-point tap engaged and Jupiter screamed. The firing sequence took 4 minutes and 17 seconds. To everyone watching from the command deck of the Meridian, it felt considerably longer than that. The SB-1 drew power in a rising cascade that made the entire construction platform vibrate at a frequency just below the threshold of human hearing. Felt in the chest, in the teeth, in the base of the skull. As the zero-point tap pulled energy from Jupiter's atmospheric gradient in quantities that turned the gas giant's equatorial band a shade of luminous violet visible to the naked eye from Earth. The magnetic containment rings along the barrel cycled to full capacity in sequence, each one igniting in a pulse of blue-white light that traveled the weapon's 3-kilometer length like a heartbeat. Inside the chamber, the exotic matter lattice holding the compressed micro-singularity registered stable. For exactly 90 seconds, humanity held a black hole in its hand. Then it let go. The round left the barrel at 0.94 light speed. It was invisible. A compressed singularity produced no light, no exhaust, no visible signature of any kind. The only evidence of its departure was a gravitational pulse that rolled outward from the platform like a shockwave, powerful enough to shunt 3 of the construction vessels from their docking positions and send them spinning into emergency stabilization burns. On the sensor arrays, a single blip traced the round's exit vector for approximately 11 seconds before it exceeded detection range and vanished into the dark. 46 years of travel, compressed into a moment of release. There was nothing to do now but wait and survive long enough for the shot to matter. The invasion fleet, as though sensing the discharge, accelerated. Within 18 hours of the firing, the fleet's advance velocity increased by a factor of 3, collapsing humanity's remaining window from 6 weeks to 9 days. 9 days to hold a defensive perimeter with weapons that had already proven useless, against an enemy whose gravitational shielding had absorbed everything humanity threw at it without registering so much as a fluctuation. Admiral Voss deployed every remaining combat asset in a dispersal pattern designed not to stop the fleet but to slow it, to buy hours, not victories. The crews of those vessels knew what they were flying into. They went anyway. Commander Oren coordinated the defensive action from the Meridian with a focus so complete it left no room for anything else. Which was, she understood precisely the point. On the 4th day, the fleet's lead elements reached the Sol corridor's outer boundary and began the geometric restructuring that had preceded the destruction of every colony system before it. Solis watched the gravitational readings from the science station, tracking the same frame drag signatures he had studied in the data from the 17 dead worlds, and something in his expression shifted, not fear, but a specific and terrible recognition. "They're not attacking the planets first," he said quietly, pulling up the sensor overlay. "They're attacking the sun." The room went cold. The fleet was positioning to induce a targeted disruption in the solar magnetosphere, a chain reaction that, if completed, would trigger a coronal mass ejection of sufficient magnitude to strip Earth's atmosphere in approximately 72 hours. They were not going to destroy humanity with weapons. They were going to use the sun itself, and they were 11 hours from completing the alignment. Oren looked at Solis. Solis looked at the data. There was nothing left to fire. There was nothing left to deploy. There was only the shot already traveling through the dark at 0.94 light speed, 46 years from its destination, and 11 hours standing between humanity and the end of everything. "Tell me," Oren said, her voice absolutely level, "that you aimed it right." Solis held her gaze without blinking. "I aimed it right," he said, but certainty and salvation, as every person on that deck understood in that moment, were not the same thing. The 11 hours passed the way that final things always pass, too fast and too slow simultaneously, every minute carrying the full weight of everything that had ever been built, loved, discovered, or dreamed by the human species. Admiral Voss kept the defensive perimeter active not because it could stop what was coming, but because she refused to let humanity's last hours be passive ones. The crews holding the line knew they were buying minutes, not miracles. They bought them anyway, with everything they had, and the minutes they purchased were the most expensive in the history of the species. On the 6th hour, the fleet completed 60% of its solar alignment. On the 8th hour, the Meridian's long-range sensors detected the first anomalous fluctuation in the sun's magnetospheric boundary layer, the opening tremor of a disruption that, once fully initiated, could not be stopped by any means available to humanity. Solis watched the readings and said nothing. There was nothing left to say that mathematics had not already said for him 46 years ago, in a targeting solution calculated on 11 days without sleep. It arrived without warning, because it could not have arrived any other way. A compressed micro-singularity traveling at 0.94 light speed produces no precursor signal, No detectable approach, no moment of anticipation. One instant, the invasion fleet's lead formation was completing its solar alignment with the unhurried precision of something that had never once been challenged. The next instant, a black hole passed through the gravitational shielding that had stopped every weapon humanity had ever fired. Passed through it the way a stone passes through smoke, because gravitational shielding works by redirecting incoming energy, and a singularity does not carry energy in any form that can be redirected. It carries gravity, and gravity answers only to itself. The round struck the fleet's central command structure, the vessel Solis had identified as the gravitational anchor of the entire formation, the keystone whose removal would collapse the geometric coherence of every ship around it. And what happened next was not an explosion. It was a restructuring of local spacetime so violent and so absolute that the Meridian sensors simply stopped returning coherent data for 4 minutes and 23 seconds. When they came back online, the fleet's gravitational signature had ceased to exist. Where 47,000 vessels had been, there was an expanding shell of disrupted spacetime and the slow, cooling silence of a battlefield that had lasted less than a second. The solar alignment collapsed unfinished. The sun steadied. Earth's magnetosphere, trembling at the edge of catastrophic failure, pulled back from the threshold and held. Orin stood at the center of the command deck and looked at the sensor display for a long time without speaking. Around her, people were crying, or laughing, or simply sitting down on the floor because their legs had decided that standing was no longer a reasonable requirement. Solis stood very still at his station, looking at the data with the expression of a man who had just watched a theorem prove itself in letters written in the fabric of reality. He had aimed it right. 46 years of transit, a targeting solution calculated on 9 days of sleepless mathematics. A single round fired into the dark at a fleet that did not yet know it was already dead, and he had aimed it right. The story did not end there, because the stories that matter never end at the moment of survival. They end at the moment of reckoning. In the weeks and months that followed, as humanity counted its dead and rebuilt its shattered colony infrastructure, the full weight of what had been done settled over the species with the slow gravity of something that could not be undone. The SB-1 still existed. The targeting solution for a second round could be calculated. The exotic matter harvesting process from SR-7 was now documented, repeatable, and understood. Humanity had not merely survived an invasion. It had become, in the span of 4 months, the only known civilization in the observable universe in possession of a weapon capable of reshaping the large-scale structure of spacetime itself. The conversations that followed were harder than the war had been, in the way that consequences are always harder than crises. Because crises demand action, and consequences demand wisdom. And wisdom has never come as naturally to the human species as the will to fight. A joint commission of every surviving government and scientific body convened on Earth 6 months after the battle, in a chamber that had been hastily rebuilt from the ruins of what the solar disruption's partial initiation had done to 3 of the planet's equatorial power grids. They debated for a long time. They did not reach easy conclusions. What they reached, after months of the most consequential argument in human history, was a covenant. Not a treaty, not a law, but something older and more binding than either. The SB-1 would be maintained. The knowledge to build another would be preserved. And both would be held under a custodianship whose sole and permanent mandate was to ensure that the weapon was never used again except in the absolute extremity of civilizational survival. They called it the Singularity Accord. It was ratified by every human government in existence, and it carried in its final paragraph a single sentence that Solis had written himself, at Oren's request, because she felt that the person who had aimed the shot should be the one to define the boundary around it. The sentence read, "We built this because we had to. We will not forget what having to felt like." The universe did not acknowledge what humanity had done. The cosmos does not pause for the achievements of civilizations, however extraordinary. Galaxies continued their slow collisions. Stars continued their burning and their dying. The background radiation of creation continued its ancient, cooling whisper across the void. But in the small, improbable corner of an unremarkable spiral galaxy, on a pale world orbiting an ordinary star, 8 billion people looked up at a sky that was still theirs, still breathable, still blue, still lit by a sun that had come within 11 hours of being turned into an instrument of their extinction, and understood, in the wordless way that survivors always understand, that they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. They had not just won a war. They had become something the universe had never seen before. Something that looked into the absolute dark, found the most destructive force in existence, and chose, deliberately, knowingly, at full understanding of the cost, to become more dangerous than the thing trying to kill them. Not out of cruelty, out of love, for every world that still had people on it, for every future that still had a chance of existing. That is what humanity is. That is what humanity has always been. And the cosmos, whether it acknowledges it or not, will never be quite the same. They built a gun that fired black holes. They aimed it across 43,000 light-years of darkness at an enemy that had never once been stopped, and they did not miss. That is not a metaphor. That is not mythology. That is the human species, operating at the absolute boundary of what matter and energy and the laws of physics permit, and then stepping across that boundary anyway, because the alternative was silence, and humanity has never been very good at silence. There will be those who look at what was built in the shadow of Jupiter and feel afraid. That fear is reasonable. A weapon capable of restructuring space-time is the kind of thing that demands fear, demands caution, demands exactly the kind of hard, uncomfortable wisdom that the Singularity Accord was written to protect. But fear was not what built the SB-1. What built it was something older and more stubborn than fear. The absolute, irrational, magnificently human refusal to accept that this is where the story ends. Every civilization that has ever risen has faced a moment when the universe presented it with something incomprehensible and waited to see what it would do. Humanity's answer, as it has always been, was to get to work. The invasion is over. The dead are mourned. The sun still burns. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, the light from a battle that lasted less than a second is still traveling outward in all directions, carrying with it the only message humanity has ever needed to send to the cosmos. We are here, we are not leaving, and we are considerably more difficult to kill than we look. This has been beyond impossible, where humanity conquers what others deem unthinkable. If this story moved you, if it reminded you why the human spirit is the most formidable force in any universe, then subscribe, because there are more stories where this one came from. More impossible odds. More moments where everything comes down to one shot, one choice, one species that refuses to quit. We will be here telling every single one of them. Until next time, stay impossible.